Say it again, someone laughed, slower this time. The room reacted before she did. A pen tapped the table, a chair leaned back. Someone muttered, unbelievable. Volin kept her hands folded, eyes steady, while a man at the far end of the table smiled and said, "So you're telling us you flew all this way for that?" A few of them chuckled. Another voice cut in, softer, sharper. "Let's be fair. This level of caution makes sense where she's from." That got louder laughter. Volin opened her mouth to respond. She didn't get the chance. "Relax," the woman at the head of the table said, smiling thinly. "This is just a contract. You're not deciding policy here." Someone slid the papers toward her like a favor. "Sign where we marked," he said. "We'll handle the rest." For the first time, Volin looked up, not angry, not embarrassed, just measuring. She nodded once and picked up the pen. None of them noticed the clause they just joked their way into. Before we go on, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss stories like this. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? No one introduced her. They never did when they'd already decided what someone was worth. Volin stood at the end of the table while the others remained seated, jackets off, sleeves rolled, relaxed in a way that told her this wasn't a negotiation, it was an evaluation. The contract lay between them, already tabbed, already marked, already owned. "Before we begin," the woman at the head of the table said, smiling with effort, "can you explain briefly why this clause is necessary?" Volin inhaled once, because it transfers exposure away from. A hand lifted, not hers. "We understand what it claims to do," a man cut in. "What we're asking is why you think we would agree to it." Someone snorted. Another leaned back, arms crossed. "You consultants always do this," a voice said. "Overcomplicate, inflate your value." Volin tried again. "If there's an investigation." "There won't be," the same man said, laughing. "And if there is, it won't touch us." The woman at the head of the table tilted her head. "Let's keep this simple. You're here to finalize, not advise." A pause, deliberate. Then the softest cut of all. "Besides," she added, "this kind of risk modeling usually comes from people who have seen messier systems." The room smiled at that. Volin felt the temperature change, not around her, but inside her. Something old shifting, aligning. She looked at the pages again, at the clause they were eager to dismiss, the one they hadn't read closely because they didn't think they needed to. "Shall we sign?" someone asked. The pen slid across the table toward her. Volin didn't hesitate. She signed. And as the ink dried, one of them glanced at the last page and frowned, just briefly, before the others stood, already done with her. None of them noticed the timestamp embedded in the signature block. They would, soon. They didn't wait for the door to close. The moment Volin stepped into the hallway, the room exhaled, jackets pulled back on, phones lifted, chairs scraping as if the meeting had been an inconvenience finally over. "Well," someone said, "that was painless." A ripple of laughter followed. The woman at the head of the table flipped the contract shut. "Send it to legal for filing. Standard process." "No need," another executive replied. "I skimmed it, nothing unusual." He hadn't skimmed it. He'd looked for his own name and stopped there. Someone poured coffee. Another joked about accents and consultants who learn fear before confidence. No one objected. Silence was agreed here. At the far end of the table, Rennick Hale lingered. He hadn't laughed. Not because he felt sympathy, he didn't, but because something about the way Volin had signed unsettled him. No pause, no negotiation, no relief, just a steady hand and a look that didn't ask permission. "Did you notice?" he said casually. "She didn't argue." Maylee's core shrugged. Why would she? She got what she wanted. Rennick nodded, though the answer didn't sit right. As the room emptied, he stayed behind, reopening the contract. Not reading, searching. He didn't know what, just something. His phone vibrated. A calendar alert he didn't remember setting. Compliance review, confirm receipt. Sent 12 minutes earlier. From an address he didn't recognize. Rennick frowned and checked the timestamp on the signed contract. Then he checked the metadata. His stomach tightened. Because the document hadn't been uploaded when she signed it. It had been logged elsewhere hours before the meeting even began. And whatever system had accepted it. I was already watching. The notice arrived without ceremony. No warning call. No courtesy email. Just a subject line stamped in neutral gray. Request for preliminary materials. Compliance Division *. Maylee's core skimmed it between meetings, barely slowing her stride. This happens all the time, she said aloud, more to reassure herself than anyone else. Random check, quarterly cycle. Still, she forwarded it to legal. Legal forwarded it to finance. Finance sent it back with a question no one liked. Why that department? Why those years? By midday, 3 assistants were pulling archived files that hadn't been touched in over a decade. Dust bloomed when cabinets opened. Passwords failed. Backup drives lagged. Small, irritating delays that felt insignificant until they weren't. Rennick watched it unfold from his office, glass walls giving him a view of controlled panic. He opened the contract again, this time reading line by line. There it was. A paragraph buried beneath standard language. Clean, precise, almost polite. In the event of regulatory inquiry, the client affirms sole custodianship of historical records, disclosures, and derivative liability. Sole custodianship. His phone rang. Rennick, legal said, voice tight, do you remember approving third-party record segregation? No, he answered slowly. Why? Because the regulators just asked why our off-site compliance mirror is empty. Rennick looked at the contract again, pulse ticking in his throat. Empty meant transferred. Transferred meant signing. Sign meant her. He closed his eyes, replaying the meeting. The jokes. The smiles. The way they'd rushed her. And for the first time since she walked out of the boardroom, Rennick felt something colder than fear settle in. Don't panic. Recognition. Whatever this was, it hadn't started today. It had started when they decided she didn't matter. And now, something was finally answering back. The recording surfaced quietly. Not leaked. Not shared. Delivered. It appeared in the internal compliance portal just after midnight, filed under a neutral tag, meeting artifacts, vendor review *. No subject line, no sender, just a file name and a timestamp that made no sense. Maylee's found it first. She clicked it out of irritation, expecting a corrupted upload or a misfiled calendar clip. Instead, her own voice filled the room, calm, polished, unmistakable. Let's keep this simple. You're here to finalize, not advise. Her smile froze on her face as the audio continued. The laughter followed. The interruptions. The remark about where she's from. Every word is preserved, clean, untouched. Maylee slammed her laptop shut and stood too fast, chair tipping backward. Who authorized this? She demanded, already dialing it. No one answered. By morning, the file had replicated itself. Legal had it. Compliance had it. Risk had it. And none of them could delete it. Every attempt triggered a system, notice citing retention obligation under executed agreement. Rennick listened to it alone in his office, door locked. Hearing it stripped of context, no faces, no justifications, made it sound worse. Crueler, smaller. He paused the playback at the moment Volan spoke. If there's an investigation. The audio cut there. Not abruptly. Deliberately. He scrolled the metadata again. The recording hadn't been made in the room. It had been rooted through it. Rennick leaned back, staring at the ceiling, understanding something too late. The meeting hadn't been documented for memory. It had been documented for use. And whatever system held it was still holding everything else too. Legal asked for a closed session. That alone was unusual. Legal didn't request meetings unless something had already gone wrong. They preferred memos, distance, plausible ignorance. This time, they wanted faces in chairs. Rennick arrived early. Maylies arrived defensive. Two others joined, laptops open, expressions tight. No one joked, no one smiled. The contract, Legal began, is binding. Maylies scoffed. Of course it is, that's not the issue. It is, the lawyer replied calmly, because of what it binds. She projected a clause onto the screen. The same paragraph Rennick had flagged, but expanded now, cross-referenced, footnoted. You see the word custodianship? The lawyer asked. That's not standard. We assumed it was synonymous with access. It isn't, Rennick said quietly. The lawyer nodded. Custodianship assigns ownership of historical liability, not future exposure, past exposure. A silence fell, heavier than the boardroom laughter ever had been. Maylies leaned forward. That's impossible. We would never agree to that. You did, the lawyer said. You just didn't read the appendix. The screen changed. Appendix F. Risk transfer events. Sub-bullets appeared, dates, jurisdictions, references to dormant inquiries. Each one aligned with a department that had just received regulatory attention. One executive swallowed. Why would a consultant even include this? The lawyer hesitated. Because, she said carefully, she knew exactly where to look. Rennick's mind flashed back to the meeting, the interruptions, the way they'd rushed her past explanations, the moment they'd slid the contract toward her and told her to sign. He exhaled slowly. They hadn't outmaneuvered her. They'd helped her. Maylies stood abruptly. Find her, she snapped. Get her back in here, we will renegotiate. No one answered. Because at that exact moment, every phone in the room buzzed at once. And the subject line was the same on all of them. Notice of expanded review, Port Records Division. Rennick closed his eyes. Port records weren't random. They were old. And they were never reopened without a reason. The port records were sealed. Everyone in the room knew that. They were the kind of files people referenced vaguely, carefully, evidence of past messes that had been settled, buried, or quietly forgotten. No charges, no follow-ups, just ash and paperwork. Rennick requested access under his credentials. Denied. Legal tried next. Also denied. By evening, an emergency call was set up with an external consultant, older, cautious, the kind of man who spoke only after listening twice. He didn't ask for details. He asked for a keyword. What exactly did the notice reference? He said. Rennick read it aloud. There was a pause on the line, too long. Read the jurisdiction, the man said. Rennick did. Another pause. Then, there's a surname associated with those records. It never surfaces unless someone forces it. Maylies scoffed. Names don't matter, entities do. Not this one, the man replied. This name ended investigations by disappearing. Rennick felt his throat tighten. What name? The consultant hesitated, then spoke it carefully, like it might travel. Sabine Kovacevic. Silence flooded the room. That's impossible, someone said. She died. Yes, the consultant agreed. Officially. Rennick's mind replayed the meeting again, Volan's calm, the way she'd listened, the precision of the contract. He pictured her signature, the odd spacing, the timestamp anomaly. A thought surfaced, unwelcome and cold. What if she didn't? He asked. No one answered him. Because at that moment, a junior analyst sent a message marked urgent. It contained a scan from the port archives. A fire report. No remains recovered. One listed casualty name, crossed out by hand. And beneath it, written later in a different ink. Status, unconfirmed asterisk. Rennick stared at the screen. The room felt smaller. And for the first time, fear replaced confusion, because if Sabine Kovacevic hadn't died in that fire, then the woman they humiliated hadn't been hiding. She'd been waiting. By morning, the building felt hostile. Not loud. Not chaotic. Wrong. Phones rang and stopped ringing. Elevators stalled between floors. Access badges failed at random, always briefly, always long enough to make the point. People began speaking in lowered voices, checking glass reflections before finishing sentences. Rennick noticed it first in the eyes. Fear doesn't look dramatic when it arrives early. It looks like hesitation, like people waiting to see who moves first. Partners stopped CCing each other. Assistants stopped gossiping. Someone from finance resigned before noon without explanation, leaving a half-written email on his screen. Maylis called an emergency board check-in. Only 3 members joined. 2 sent apologies. 1 didn't respond at all. "We're losing control of the narrative," Maylis said, packing. "This is external pressure. We just need to ride it out." Rennick didn't answer. He was reading an internal alert that hadn't been sent company-wide. Data segregation is complete. External mirror verified. Verified by whom? His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. 1 line of text. "You said there wouldn't be an investigation." Rennick stared at it, pulse pounding. He hadn't said that in writing. He hadn't said it to anyone who should remember. Across the room, Maylis froze mid-sentence. Her phone slipped from her hand and hit the table face down. She didn't pick it up. "I think," Rennick said slowly, "we should stop pretending this is random." Maylis swallowed. "Then what is it?" Rennick looked at the glass walls, the city beyond them, still moving like nothing had changed. "It's pressure," he said, "applied by someone who knows exactly how much we can take." His phone vibrated once more. Another message. "You signed for all of it." Rennick closed his eyes. Because the worst part wasn't that someone was watching. It was whoever it was. Had already finished setting the trap. Volan Collins stood at the kitchen sink, hands submerged in still water, listening. The apartment was quiet in the careful way that came from practice. No television noise, no unnecessary lights, nothing that invited attention. Outside, traffic passed without interest. Inside, everything had a place. Her phone vibrated once on the counter. She didn't look at it. Across the room, Mia sat at the table, homework spread neatly in front of her. Pencil moving. Focused. Too focused. Children noticed more than they were meant to, especially when adults believed silence was protection. Volan withdrew her hands and dried them slowly. The phone vibrated again. She glanced down. No name, no message preview, just a signal that something had updated. Exactly on time. Volan allowed herself a breath, not relief, alignment. The kind that came when variables behaved as expected. The company was reacting now, not understanding, not yet, but tightening in all the wrong places. "Mom," Mia said without looking up. "Yes." "Why do people keep calling and hanging up?" Volan paused. "They're checking old numbers," she said evenly. "They'll stop." Mia nodded, accepting the answer the way children do when they don't fully believe it but don't want to push. Volan moved toward the window, careful with her reflection. She checked the street below, then her phone. A single line appeared. Phase 1 complete. She locked the screen. Behind her, a chair creaked. "I heard a name earlier," Mia said quietly. Volan didn't turn around. "What name?" Mia hesitated. "On the phone, it didn't sound like yours." Volan felt the shift then, the smallest fracture. Because some questions didn't demand answers. They announced their arrival. And once they arrived, they never left. The arrest didn't make the news right away. That was intentional. It came through internal channels first. An abrupt calendar cancellation, a security badge deactivated mid-morning, a black sedan idling too long at the curb before pulling away with purpose. By noon, the floor knew. No announcements, no explanations, just absence. Rennick stood by the window of his office, watching as the parking space beneath him remained empty. It belonged to Darian Holt, head of procurement, loudest voice in the room that day, the first to laugh when Volan had tried to speak. Unrelated charges, legal said over speakerphone. Personal exposure, we're advising distance. Distance from what? The file was sealed, but not before someone had seen the charge codes. Not before someone had noticed the dates aligned with the same years referenced in Appendix F. The same years tied to the port. Maylis called it coincidence. She had too. The alternative required acknowledging pattern, and pattern meant intent. Rennick opened his email. A message waited, flagged urgently by the system, not by a sender. Custodianship confirmed, proceeding under Clause 14b. He read it twice. Clause 14b wasn't punitive. It was permissive. It allowed disclosure without notice if risk had been misrepresented during execution. Execution. He remembered Volan's pen moving across the page, the way she'd nodded once, like the decision had already been made somewhere else. The elevator dinged outside his office. Footsteps passed, hurried uneven. Someone whispered, "She did this." Rennick closed his door. Because for the first time, the fear in the building had a direction. And it was pointing backward, toward a meeting they could never undo. Toward a woman they had already dismissed. And the worst realization of all. If this was only the first fall, then the others were still standing on borrowed time. The request went out through 3 layers. Not to Volan directly. Never directly. First to a generic inbox, then to a compliance liaison that no longer existed. Finally, through a third-party mediator who specialized in misunderstandings. Rennick approved it himself. By the time Volan agreed to meet, the tone had already shifted, from authority to need. They chose a private conference suite off-site, neutral, expensive, quiet enough to feel safe. Rennick arrived early, Maylis arrived rehearsed. Volan arrived exactly on time. She wore the same restraint she'd worn in the boardroom. No embellishment, no visible reaction to the room or the tension waiting inside it. Maylis stood first. "Thank you for coming, we just want to clear the air." Volan sat. "About the contract." "Yes," Rennick said quickly. "There were misinterpretations on both sides." Volan tilted her head slightly. "Which clause?" Maylis glanced at Rennick. He hesitated a fraction too long. "That's what we thought," Volan said calmly. Rennick leaned forward. "We're prepared to amend, reassign liability, quietly." Volan didn't answer right away. She looked at the table, at the glass, at the reflection of people who had once laughed. "Before I respond," she said, "I have one question." They waited. "When you told me there wouldn't be an investigation," she continued evenly, "was that a promise or a belief?" The silence stretched. Because only one of those was forgivable. Maylis swallowed. "That's not relevant." Volan smiled then, not kindly. "It is," she said, standing, "because beliefs don't hold up under review." Rennick felt it then, the finality. "You're refusing?" he asked. Volan met his eyes. "I already accepted," she said. "You just didn't notice." She left without another word. And as the door closed behind her, Rennick understood something with sick clarity. This meeting hadn't been an apology attempt. It was a test. And they had failed. It was reported the next morning, in a tone so neutral it felt intentional. No headline. No speculation. Just a brief internal notice, circulated among senior staff before anyone outside the company knew to look. Incident involving former executive. Authorities are investigating. No immediate connection to ongoing matters. Rennick read it twice, then once more slower. Former executive. That was new. The man's name sat there, stripped of title, reduced to a line item. The same man who had leaned back in his chair during the meeting. The same man who had laughed loudest when Volin was interrupted. The official explanation came later, carefully phrased, impossibly clean. An accident. Unfortunate. No evidence of foul play. The kind of language that closed doors instead of opening them. Maylis locked herself in her office after that. No calls. No meetings. The building moved around her like a body trying to ignore pain. Rennick didn't pretend. He opened the contract again, searching not for clauses this time, but for patterns. Timing, sequence, cause and effect. The arrest. The audit. The exposure. Now this, not chaos. Order. His phone buzzed once. No number. No greeting. Just a single sentence. Consequences don't need witnesses. Rennick's hands went cold. He knew enough now to understand what that meant and what it didn't. This wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge spilling over. It was restraint. And restraint was far more frightening. Across the city, the company's name began slipping quietly out of conversations that once welcomed it. Invitations disappeared. Calls went unanswered. Rennick looked at the window, at his reflection layered over the skyline. They had wanted to feel powerful. They had mistaken cruelty for safety. And now one of them is gone. Not publicly mourned. Not defended. Just removed. The worst part wasn't the death itself. It was the certainty settling in his chest. If this had been meant as a warning, then it had arrived exactly when it was supposed to. Rennick didn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table long after the city outside went dark, the contract open in front of him like a confession he hadn't written but couldn't deny. He wasn't reading it anymore. He was tracing it, dates, phrasing, cross-references, following the quiet intelligence behind it. At 2:14 a.m., he found it. A pattern in the numbering, not random, regional formatting, Eastern ports, old compliance language that hadn't been taught in decades. He opened a sealed archive through a personal contact he hadn't used since law school. It took one favor and a silence he couldn't afford. The file loaded slowly. A photograph appeared. Grainy, burned at the edges. A woman standing near a warehouse, half turned from the camera. The name beneath it stopped his breath. Sabine Kovacevic. Official status, deceased. Cause, fire. Remains, unconfirmed. Rennick leaned back, heart hammering. He saw her then, not as Volin Collins in the boardroom, not as the quiet consultant, but as both at once. The restraint, the precision, the way she'd allowed them to believe they were choosing. His phone rang. He almost didn't answer. Stop, he said the moment the line connected. Just stop, we didn't know. A pause, then her voice. You did, Volin said calmly. You just didn't think it mattered. Rennick swallowed. What do you want? Another pause. For you, she replied, to remember that this ended when it could have ended. The line went dead. Rennick stared at the phone, understanding something that hollowed him out. She hadn't destroyed them because she could. She had stopped herself from doing worse. And that mercy, unasked for, unexplained, was the most terrifying confirmation of all. Mia didn't raise her voice. That was what unsettled Volin most. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, evening light thinning through the window, the city outside settling into its night rhythm. Dinner had gone untouched. The quiet wasn't heavy, it was deliberate. Who is Sabine? Mia asked. Volin's hand paused mid-movement. She didn't ask how Mia found the name. She already knew. Children didn't need proof. They needed patterns, and Volin had broken one. It's an old name, Volin said carefully. From before. Before what? Volin met her daughter's eyes. Before I was your mother. Mia nodded, absorbing that without relief. Is she the reason people are scared? Volin didn't answer immediately. She stood, carried the plates to the sink, let water run longer than necessary. When she turned back, Mia was holding a folded paper she'd taken from the drawer beneath the phone. A document, old, official. A fire report. One name crossed out. Mia looked up. You said you survived an accident. You didn't say someone else didn't. Volan felt the distance from then. Clean, precise, irreversible. I did what I had to, Volan said. For who? Mia asked. The question cut deeper than accusation. For you, Volan replied. Mia stood. She didn't shout, she didn't cry. I believe you, she said quietly, but I don't think I know you. She went to her room and closed the door, not hard, not soft. Final. Volan remained at the table, long after the apartment went still. Because protection had always been the justification. But now it was also the cost. And for the first time since the boardroom, Volan wondered whether silence, this time, had arrived too late. The press found the story last. By then, it was already over. What reached the headlines looked clinical: stock volatility, leadership changes, unexpected exposure tied to legacy compliance failures. Analysts debated numbers. Commentators debated timing. No one debated the cause because no one could see it clearly enough to name it. Inside the company, there was no debate at all. The board dissolved itself in stages. Resignations arrived in pairs, then clusters, then silence. Offices emptied without ceremony. Security badges were surrendered at reception desks by people who had once walked past them without looking. Rennick watched the final meeting remotely. Cameras off, mics muted. A vote passed without discussion. The company would be split, sold, absorbed. Its name retired quietly, as if it had never mattered enough to remember. No one mentioned Volan Collins. No one mentioned the contract. They spoke instead about unfortunate sequencing and external pressure, language designed to soften guilt without denying it. After the call ended, Rennick remained seated, staring at his reflection on the black screen. He thought about the meeting room weeks earlier. The jokes, the certainty, the way they'd believed control was permanent. His phone buzzed once more. Not from her. From a federal contact. File reopened. Historical scope expanded. No further action required from you. Rennick understood the message for what it was. A closing door. Volan had not pushed this to the end. She had stepped away at the precise moment collapse became inevitable. Across the city, offices darkened floor by floor. Signs came down. Websites redirected. A company that had once filled rooms with confidence now existed only as a cautionary mention. And somewhere beyond the reach of press releases and final statements, the woman they had humiliated continued preparing to leave. Because collapse was never the objective. Containment was. And it had been achieved. Volan packed only what couldn't be replaced. Documents went first, not many, just enough to prove existence without inviting questions. Cash followed, divided, wrapped, hidden where habit had taught her to hide it. The rest stayed behind. Furniture, dishes, evidence of a life meant to look permanent. Mia watched from the doorway. You said we wouldn't move again, she said. Volan didn't correct her. Promises were dangerous things when spoken too confidently. I said we'd try, Volan replied. Mia nodded, accepting the answer the way she had learned to, without agreement. She carried her backpack to the door and set it down with care. Outside, a car idled. Not a familiar one, neutral, temporary. Volan took one last look at the apartment. The quiet had changed here. Not unsafe. Exposed. The kind of exposure that came from being remembered. Her phone vibrated. A final update. Legacy channels closed. No further contact advised. She deleted it without reading it twice. In the car, the city slid past like a story she no longer belonged to. Mia leaned her head against the window, eyes open, watching lights blur into anonymity. Are they still afraid? Mia asked softly. Volan hesitated. Yes, she said, but not of us. The car turned onto the highway. Behind them, investigations continued without names. Careers ended without explanation. A company faded into case studies and footnotes. Ahead of them, there were new papers to file, new schools, new habits. What there would not be was a return. Volin closed her eyes, not in relief but in acceptance. Because running was no longer a tactic. It was the sentence. And she would carry it, quietly, for as long as it kept her daughter alive. Years later, no one used the company's name anymore. It surfaced only in footnotes, in closed seminars, in cautionary slides marked legacy failure asterisk. There were no villains assigned, no heroes, just a timeline that stopped abruptly as if the story had lost interest in continuing. Rennick Hale read one of those reports alone. He was no longer an executive. He taught now risk, ethics, the language of restraint. Students listened when he spoke, not because he was inspiring, but because he sounded like someone who had learned too late. He never mentioned the woman. He never mentioned the meeting. But sometimes, when asked how institutions fall without a single visible blow, he paused longer than necessary before answering. Because they humiliate the wrong person, he would say, and mistake silence for absence. In another city, under another name, Volin watched Mia board a bus she hadn't ridden before. New school, new friends, a future that didn't know what it had been protected from. They spoke less now. Not from anger. From a distance. Mia had learned enough to know that love and fear could share the same source. Volin had learned that protection did not guarantee closeness, only survival. That night, Volin stood by a window she hadn't memorized yet and deleted the last archived file on her phone. The final trace of a woman the world believed had died in a fire. Sabine Kovacevic vanished again. Not into power. Into anonymity. And somewhere far away, people who had once laughed in a glass-walled room still woke some nights with the same thought pressing against their ribs. They never saw it coming. Because by the time they understood who she was, there was nothing left to confront. Only the knowledge that consequences didn't need faces. They only needed time. No one ever apologized. Years later, former executives spoke of blind spots and culture failures. They never mentioned the meeting, never named the woman. The recording was sealed. The contract became a case study. The fire stayed a footnote no one explained. Volin Collins stopped watching the fallout. Distance mattered more than outcomes. Mia grew older, quieter, more careful with her questions. Love remained between them, so did the space. Some truths weren't denied. They were avoided. At night, Volin remembered the moment before she signed. The moment she could have walked away. She never regretted the decision. Only the reminder of who she used to be. Because power, once used again, never disappears. It only waits. And somewhere, people still humiliate those they believe are small, never realizing how often history is already sitting across the table, silent, taking notes. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe. Stories like this only work when they're heard all the way through. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Volin was right to act, or should she have walked away and stayed hidden? At what moment did you realize the company had already lost? Have you ever seen someone underestimated the same way, and what happened after? Your answers help shape the next story.